hear about the need for an energy Marshall Plan as Europeans and Americans face some of the highest energy prices in a generation. Germany has now moved to phase 2 and an alert level on their emergency gas plan. And German Economy Minister Robert Habeck has stated that Germany is in a gas crisis with winter looming. So European countries are now considering reopening coal-fired plants to maintain energy supplies. What is the transatlantic play here? I cannot think of two better people to help us think through this critical topic than Tom Wilson of the Financial Times and Darren Woods, Chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. Tom, Darren, come on down. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to have Darren Woods here today. As was just mentioned there, energy's been thrust onto the front pages of every global newspaper in the last 9 months, including ours. And there's really no better person to come and talk to us about what that means and why than Darren Woods. Darren joined Exxon in 1992. He's got a wealth of experience across the last 30 years. And for those that don't know, ExxonMobil is the second largest oil and gas company in the world. But to put it in some perspective, I mean, Shell's the largest European major. By market cap terms, Exxon's double the size of Shell. So this is really one of the big beasts of the oil and gas industry. Darren, we've got lots to talk about, but let's start on the macro. We heard in those introductory remarks discussions of a gas crisis here. I mean, when you look at both oil and gas supply and demand, do you see this as an energy crisis? And how severe is it?
Yeah, I think I would put what we're seeing today in the context of what the industry lived through during the pandemic. I think people have quickly forgotten just how stressed the global industry was around the world, not just with IOCs, but NOCs, basically all those who were participating when the prices collapsed, demand collapsed. Prices ended up taking all the revenue out of the industry, and in an industry that is a depletion industry that has to continually invest to offset that depletion and keep supply stable, those investments weren't coming because industry simply didn't have the revenues. Most in industry borrowed very heavily in 2020 to make it through the pandemic, and then as we came out of the pandemic into 2021, a lot of the industry was rebuilding their balance sheet, paying back that debt. And so you've got a 2-year hiatus where we weren't seeing the kind of investments needed, and that's slowly starting to ramp back up. But as a result of that, we've depleted supplies, haven't made those investments, and so we were getting tight. And what we've seen with the Ukraine invasion is that issue has been exacerbated. But fundamentally, we were heading to a very tight market with high prices in the base case. And I think that's what we're going to live through. And then the challenge we've got as an industry is how do you accelerate the investments required to get supply back up to meet the demands around the world for both oil and gas.
Just to stay on these shortages, I mean, to start with oil, for example, do you think we will actually get to the point where there'll be an oil shortage this year?
I think, one of the issues, and people talk about the price environment, I mean, that's the advantage of the commodity markets is when you see supply is short, demand's high, prices rise, that is the natural allocator of supply. So I don't think you ever run out of oil, but prices become very high, which then creates its own natural allocation and demand drops off. And so, they always say that the cure to high prices is high prices, and that's exactly what I think we'll see. So it's a question of how high prices eventually rise.
And do you think that pertains today? Because the thing that's changed, I guess, in the last 5 years is the attitudes of international oil companies to production. So because of the pressure for the energy transition, many of your competitors have committed to cut production over the course of the next decade. I mean, Exxon hasn't done that.
No.
I mean, I'll come back to that part, but given that normally high prices result in increased demand, can that still happen today, or given the constraints that the likes of BP and Shell have put on themselves? I mean, where's this extra supply going to come from?
Well, I think, one of the challenges our industry, if you looked at what's happened in the pipeline of development for oil, let's stick with that for a minute. One of the challenges has historically been, you start with finding the oil. That long lead exploration cycle that then leads to discoveries and then developments, that pipeline is a lot thinner than it was in the past because of some of the pressure that you're talking about, and I think an optimistic view about how quickly the transition was going to happen. And so that long lead pipeline, which has historically been essential to the industry, is not as full as it has been historically. A lot more emphasis has been placed on the unconventional in the U.S., which has a much shorter time horizon and cycle. So if you look at the investment in upstream and in oil, there's been a skewing into the unconventional sector of the business. And that's got its own challenges today with the resource limits that they're having, and what I'd say is greater emphasis on returning more cash to investors. And so you've got a dynamic happening where more emphasis has been put on unconventional, and that's not as productive as it has been in the past. And so I think that's the challenge that you see, and getting out of that will require greater development across the spectrum, not only in unconventionals, but some of these longer lead. And the challenge there are multi-billion-dollar investments with long time horizons. And how do you think about that with the uncertainty associated with the transition? And that is a difficult balance to strike. And so I would tell you, it's not the high price environment that's going to incentivize that. It's finding the resources which are robust to the low price environment. Because if you're going to make those multi-billion-dollar investments that have time horizons 10, 20 years, you got to make sure that that investment is going to be robust to a very low price environment.
So is your view and ExxonMobil's view that oil and gas companies still need to be out in the world looking for new sources of hydrocarbons, or should they be investing their dollars into trying to transition away from hydrocarbons?
Well, I think it's going to be a function of what alternatives are available to society to meet the needs. I mean, we've put a lot of emphasis in this discussion on the transition in oil and gas on the supply side of the equation, which is the oil companies and the gas companies. There's another, you've got to balance that with the demand side of the equation. I mean, we don't create demand, we meet it. And then the question is, given that level of demand and the important role that energy plays in economic development and people's personal circumstances and their standards of living, what alternatives are available to those people? And if they don't have good alternatives versus oil and gas, that will remain in demand. I think that's the challenge as you look around the world, is do we have a robust set of alternatives to meet that growing need for energy? And I think in some places we've got good solutions. There are other places where there are significant gaps. And so while those gaps exist, while we're working on the technologies and the solutions to provide an alternative, lower emission source of energy, oil and gas is still going to be needed. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the third parties who make projections out to that time horizon, oil and gas will continue to play a role in society through 2050, even in the net zero scenarios. So oil and gas is not going away. And the focus ought to be on addressing the emissions. And I think, society as a whole has taken a shortcut in terms of reducing the emissions to mitigate and manage the impact of climate change, and a shortcut to let's get rid of oil and gas. The focus ought to stay very clearly on how do we reduce those emissions. To the extent you can reduce oil and gas in the combustion of those, that will help. To the extent you can't, find other ways to reduce those emissions. Carbon capture and storage is a great example of that.
You mentioned in passing just now that governments had set net zero targets to cut emissions, but hadn't really done anything to deal with demand. I mean, with hindsight, do you think policymakers have made a big mistake there in putting pressure on production, on supply, but not dealing with demand? And is that why we're in this situation today?
I think part of what we see today is a consequence of that. And not only not dealing with the demand side of the equation, but not recognizing that you need a fairly robust set of alternative solutions if you're going to reliably and affordably meet the needs of people and their energy needs. And I think, with wind and solar, that's certainly going to play a very important role. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And we haven't, as a society, come up with a good solution set for the intermittency associated with those two energy sources. And so as wind and solar penetrate deeper into our energy systems, the intermittency issue will become more and more of a challenge, and we've got to find a solution set for that.
Let's bring it back to today and the situation that Europe finds itself in. To some extent, from what you've said, Europe was already, or the world was heading towards this type of shortage. The world was, yeah. And then Europe's found itself in a particularly exposed position because of the events in Russia. When you look at the way that Europe and the European Union has responded to this potential shortage of gas and this potential shortage of oil. So the proposals it's put in place for improved energy efficiency, for increased investments in renewables, for the way it's fired up coal-powered fire stations. When you look at those suite of responses, are they the right responses, or are there other things that you think Europe should be doing?
Well, I think, efficiency is a really important step. So I think, and that starts to hit on the demand side of the equation. So my sense is what we've seen happening here in Europe is governments, I think, effectively pulling all the levers available to them, because the reality is you don't have any one big lever you can pull to solve this problem. It's going to take a suite of options and changes to try to address that potential shortfall. And so I think the path they're going down is the right one. They're trying to accelerate options for bringing in more LNG. Unfortunately, they've had to put more coal plants on, which is a much higher emission source of energy, but they've done that in recognition of the need to build inventories in gas. I think, that's, given the situation that we find ourselves in, that's a necessary step to be taken. Accelerating where you can, and addressing the permitting delays with wind and solar, an important part of that as well. So I think that suite is the right suite, because you don't have many more options available to you, frankly. And I think the dependence and the role that Russian gas plays in the EU is so substantive, it's hard to decouple the two.
I guess, therefore, looking forward, a big question now depends on what happens to that gas supply. So there's been reports in the press about whether or not Russia might be squeezing that supply at this point in time. Is that fundamental to European future energy security and how the next few years evolves? Exactly what happens to that supply?
Well, I think in the math that we've done, it's hard to see. Russian gas is such a substantial part of the EU energy system, it's hard to see that completely going away. Despite all the diversification and alternative steps that are being taken. And then the question remains, for whatever gas Russia continues to supply, what does Russia do with that? And I think I can't speculate on what the Russians will do, but I think there is a legitimate and serious exposure there.
Let's talk about what potentially the US can do, or what Exxon could do specifically. Obviously, we're here at the German Marshall Fund, an organization kind of premised on transatlantic cooperation. And historically, there's been a lot of talk about the role that US LNG can play in providing gas into Europe, and that's certainly increased over the last decade. And Exxon yourselves, I think you import about 24 billion cubic meters of natural gas into the block every year. Are you looking to increase those supplies into Europe, or are you looking at other ways in which you can help Europe through this period?
Well, you made the point before, we have continued to invest in oil and gas, and that we started a fairly aggressive campaign back in 2018 with the recognition that the industry as a whole was underinvesting, and we also looked at gas as being an important long-term source of energy supply, whether it's in its current form as methane being burned directly, or as you think about the transition moving forward, converting methane into hydrogen and burning hydrogen. But there is, I think, a long life for natural gas in one of its forms. And so we've continue to make investments. We've actually got a very large project in conjunction with Qatar Energy in the U.S. It's an LNG export terminal that we're in the process of building. We maintained our investment in that even as we went through the pandemic, and we're struggling on the cash flow side of the equation. We've got gas coming on in Mozambique later this year with one of the partnerships that we have there, offshore LNG development. And we've got future developments in Mozambique that we're working on. And then we've got our PNG facility, which has been running above design capacity to make sure that we're supplying as much LNG as possible to the world, but also have projects there that we'll bring on. So we've got a pretty healthy pipeline of LNG. The shortest option will be our Golden Pass facility in Texas. That should come on sometime in 2024. But the other ones will have a longer time horizon just because of the investment required and the size of those investments.
As you're in Europe for the first time in a while, can I ask you about one of your European assets, Groningen, which you've had for a long time, the Dutch field, which isn't really that far away from here. Dutch government intends to shut that down this year because of the tremor history that we've all read about. Is there any way that you can see that decision changing?
That's really a question for the Dutch government. I think the gas is there, and there are obviously challenges associated with the production of that gas. A lot of dialogue around how that can be managed and successfully managed to mitigate some of the issues associated with that production, but I think ultimately it'll have to be the Dutch government that decides what they want to do in that space.
It's interesting. I hear you kind of speak quite bullishly about the investments that you've made in the last 3 or 4 years in production capacity at a time when some of your competitors were pulling back. I mean, Exxon has now made net zero 2050 targets itself. And I just wonder, kind of thinking about the way in which you talk about increasing Exxon's gas production and indeed increasing oil production, how you can eventually lower emissions whilst increasing output. I mean, do you think it's possible for an oil company to increase output and reduce emissions?
Yeah, I think it is possible. I mean, one of the comments I've made in this space for quite some time now is I don't think it's an either-or proposition. It's an and proposition. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So, you know, we set very aggressive targets for 2025 with respect to our emissions reduction and achieved those 4 years early while we were growing production. In the Permian, we have been significantly reducing our emissions while growing production. In fact, we've made a commitment in the Permian and are developing plans for 2030 to be net zero in our Permian production, which is one of our fastest growing oil production facilities. And so there's a great example of where I can increase production and reduce emissions at the same time. And for all of our assets around the world, as part of our ambition to reach net zero by 2050, you know, we felt very strongly that it's not about making aspirational statements. It's about translating objectives into plans. And so we're in the process for every one of our large facilities around the world to develop abatement curves and to understand what will be required to decarbonize those facilities and to get to net zero for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for those facilities. And as you go down that abatement curve, as you get to more and more of the emissions, the cost gets higher and higher. And so there will be policy required to incentivize some of those steps, or there will be technology breakthroughs to try to reduce the cost of those steps. The beauty of putting together these abatement curves for all our facilities is it allows us to focus exactly on the technology required and the level of advancement we need and the reduction of that cost to make those steps more economical. So we're in the process of doing that.
I think we should, as you pointed out there, what you're talking about there is Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So the emissions generated from your operations when you drill and bring the oil up. So some of your competitors have taken responsibility for Scope 3 emissions to varying extents. If I understand it right, Exxon hasn't done that. So
that's right.
Whose responsibility is Scope 3?
So I would frame it a little bit differently. I think, you know, what we as a company are focused on is helping society reduce emissions through the things that we control directly and trying to develop alternatives to replace existing higher emission sources of energy or products with new ones. And so I do think the objective that's linked to a Scope 3 discussion is a valid one, which is, you know, what are companies trying to do to reduce emissions for society as a whole. But I think setting individual targets for individual companies have a lot of potentially unintended consequences associated with it. And I'll just give you one example. You've just been asking me about the work we've been doing around LNG and growing LNG, which for every ton of LNG we produce, every incremental ton of LNG we produce, we're backing out coal somewhere in the world in power generation. As I grow my LNG business and back coal out and reduce society's emissions, my Scope 3 emissions go up. And so the question is, do you want me to do that or not? And if I put an objective on limiting my own Scope 3 emissions, that then starts to take those types of developments off the table. If you look at what we've done in my refining business, we are collectively, if you look across the aggregate of my refining business around the world, we are some of the least energy intensive and therefore lowest emissions refiners in the world. That's been independently benchmarked by outside parties. If I back off of producing gasoline and diesel while it's still in demand, people around the world are still needing those. You're taking it out of some of the most efficient refineries with the lowest emissions and moving them by definition to a higher emitting refining source. That's not good for society. So there's a lot of examples of where I think companies should be judged on the work that they're doing to lower societal emissions and be very thoughtful about how you measure that. And I think this very crude approach of just saying a Scope 3 and a target will lead to a lot of unintended consequences. You're going to drive the production and the growth in oil and gas out of the most visible, probably some of the most responsible companies, into less visible, less transparent, and potentially less responsible companies. And I don't think that's the right answer for society. And
do you find making that argument now, you had a better reception today than you might have done 2 years ago. So think back kind of to 2020, you were making similar arguments and you're getting pushback from investors. I wonder now with people talking more openly about energy security, whether you're finding that argument lands.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's so much around energy security as I would just say, this is a space that there are more and more people getting engaged in terms of how we solve that. More and more thoughtful people being engaged. And so the way I would describe what's been happening in this space is the size of the pool of people who are worried about this and focused on trying to solve it is growing. And as that pool has grown, the thinking has become more sophisticated. They begin to see some of the pitfalls associated with some of the approaches. And that's an evolution that we've seen, frankly, across the whole. I can tell you the very beginning, when we were focused on Scope 1 and 2, and there's a lot of focus on that, we saw companies divesting higher emissions assets as a way to get their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions down. And if you think about the impact that has on society, it's zero. Because all they've done is moved it out of one accounting system into another. And initially, though, there's a lot of emphasis on that. I think with time, people began to realize that's not actually solving any of the problems. And so they really de-emphasized reducing Scope 1 and 2 through divestment because you're just moving the box around, and have stepped back and looked at it more holistically. So I would say in all these areas, as the thinking's evolved, it's got more critical, more understanding of what I would say is the macro, the holistic view, and how do you ultimately solve this problem around the world. And drawing a box around any individual company may not give you the right answer when you step back and look across society. And I think that's just an evolution. And my suspicion is all of us will learn more as we go forward and come up with better thinking around how we manage that.
Let's start taking a few questions from the floor, if we have any, for Mr. Woods. Here we go. Let's take one here, if we can get a microphone to this gentleman.
Lovely,
Just introduce yourself first.
I'm come from Romania. You actually ended where my question starts. So you said as we go along, we learn. Or you learn, we all learn.
We all learn,
we live in highly uncertain futures. But a company as big as yours needs to plan ahead, not just 2-3 years, 10, 20 years. If you look at Exxon in 2030, let's say, it's a big benchmark, right, or milestone. How do you see Exxon in 2030, and what technologies that you're pushing for now you think will change the way the company looks in 2030 and even the industry?
Yeah, okay. Well, we have been doing a lot of changes from an organizational standpoint, which was meant to give us a lot more flexibility. So today, we have 3 primary businesses. We have an upstream business, we have a product solutions business, which is our heritage chemical and downstream businesses, and then we have a low carbon solutions business, which contains a portfolio of products that we believe, and I think others believe, will be critical to solving the energy transition and closing the gap in lowering emissions. So that's carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, biofuels, probably ammonia is in that space. And so, and we've centralized a lot of the capabilities that support those businesses. So one area that we've centralized is our projects organization. And by doing that, I now have the flexibility of shifting projects resources to the business with the greatest opportunity. So as those opportunities evolve, I can shift resources to fund those. That gives me a lot of optionality and flexibility. And then how quickly the low carbon solutions business grows, which I think is the point of your question, will be a function of how quickly the opportunity set develops, which will be a function of how quickly do we see market incentives for that develop, or do we see policy that incentivizes those investments. And today we have a portfolio of $15 billion, which are generating returns based on the advantages that we can carve out in existing policy around the world. As part of that portfolio, we also have projects that don't have great returns, but we're using as a basis to develop options for policymakers to build policy around to incentivize low-cost carbon reduction steps. So I think the answer is we're positioned to grow that business significantly, and the rate and pace at which we grow it will be a function of the policy and the market incentives that develop over time.
Let's take another question here, a quick one.
Could you say anything about the gas reserves under the Black Sea and why those haven't already been exploited and what their values are and how that's affecting current geopolitics?
I couldn't give you an assessment of what's happening within the Black Sea. What I would say is there are challenges associated with developments in that space, which geopolitical challenges, which I think is impacting what's happening there.
Any more questions? This gentleman at the back had his hand up, I think, a couple of times.
Thank you very much for the great discussion. My name is Alex. I represent the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. I'm actually doing research on hydrogen. You briefly mentioned that. I would have two questions. First is, do you really believe that hydrogen will be that silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems of energy transition, and so that we can basically convert everything to hydrogen, and then that'll be the solution? And what's your company's take on hydrogen? Will it be primarily used to decarbonize oil refining, or what's your perspective on that? Thank you very much.
Sure. I would say I don't think in this space there are any silver bullets. So no, I would not suggest to this group that hydrogen is going to solve everybody's problems in here. But I do think it's going to play a very, very important role. And I would just give you an example. This is not theory. I mean, one of the things that we stay very focused on is, while we think longer term and have high aspirations in terms of what we want to achieve, we also need to see those get translated into projects, because ultimately, until the rubber meets the road and steel goes in the ground, there's a lot of talk without a lot of progress. We're actually decarbonizing one of our chemical plants in Houston, in the Gulf Coast area. And we're basically taking methane, converting it to hydrogen, pulling that methane out of our furnaces in our chemical plant, replacing it with methane. And then in the process of making that hydrogen, capturing the CO2 and sequestering it. So there's a real example of making hydrogen, burning that in the furnaces for zero emissions, and then sequestering the CO2 associated with the process of making that hydrogen. We're sizing the hydrogen facilities big enough to supply a local trucking company who's converting their fleets to hydrogen. And so there's an example, a real-world example in our portfolio of investments where we're using hydrogen and decarbonizing not only our own facilities, but transportation facilities. Now, I would tell you that's a model that works in the circumstances of that plant and the logistics systems that we're addressing. I think the one point that doesn't get talked enough about is there's going to be a variety of solution sets all around the world. And it's going to be a function of the circumstances of each of those areas. That works very well for us in the Baytown area. It won't necessarily work every place. And so I think it's going to be, what we all as an industry ought to be focused on, and what I would say policymakers ought to be focused on, is incentivize reducing CO2, and then let businesses and the markets figure out, given the combination of solutions that are available, which one is the most economic to achieve that outcome given the circumstances. I think blue hydrogen in the U.S., particularly in the Gulf Coast, is going to play a very important role because of the methane that's available there and the storage space that we have. Much less so in Europe, where I think green hydrogen will have a bigger role to play. But blue hydrogen, there will still be a role for that. And we ought to stop focusing on the colors and focus on the ultimate objective, which is reducing CO2.
Dan, we're out of time, but interviewer's prerogative. I'm going to ask you one final question because it's on the news. So short answer if you'd like. What did you think of the G7's proposal for a price cap on Russian oil? Does that make sense, and would that work?
I would tell you, generally, I'm a kind of a free market. I think the markets work, and the oil and gas markets work very efficiently and effectively. There are obviously unique circumstances here. It's not obvious to me how that mechanism would work. I certainly understand the objective that they're trying to achieve and support that objective. Exactly how that manifests itself, I'm not sure. It's not obvious to me how that will work. It feels like it will be a complicated challenge there, but I'm not very involved in those conversations. Not involved at all, in fact.
Thank you, fantastic. Look, we're out of time, so I'm just going to thank Darren Woods for his time with us.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, thank you very much. That was a terrific conversation. We're going to switch gears slightly now and talk more directly about the security